America has been plagued with unspeakable crimes and unexplained phenomena that have captured nationwide attention and intrigue, demanding answers and retribution. However, many of these mysteries never get explained. Mysteries to this day that are still thwarting the best efforts of countless law enforcement and investigative teams. Serial killers never identified. Treasures lost. Murderers never caught. And conspiracy upon conspiracy spinning into tangled webs of inconclusive evidence and unresolved truths. This compelling documentary series presents a countdown of America's 60 most notorious unsolved mysteries and crimes in a dramatic compilation revealing these unanswered questions in 10 fascinating episodes. A shadowy area deep in the Nevada desert. The assassination of America's greatest civil rights leader. Hysteria in 17th century New England. And 18.5 minutes of erased tape mark America's 9 through 6 greatest unsolved mysteries. In the 21st century, there are still people in America who are Satan worshipers, who practice witchcraft, who cast spells and curses. There are people who follow ancient voodoo ceremonies. Watching them go through their satanic rituals, perform their black magic and voodoo, it's not at all hard to imagine that over 300 years ago in 1692, God-fearing Puritans from the otherwise sane and stable community of Salem, Massachusetts, went into a fear-filled frenzy of killing, of hunting down and killing witches, of killing their neighbors. A frenzy whose cause to this day remains one of the biggest mysteries of colonial America.
The Salem witch trials are probably one of the strangest, really, incidents in early American history, at least in the history of the American colonies. In 1692, there was a young girl in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, who began having seizures and spells, and then it spread from one girl to several other girls. And when asked what was causing this, they claimed that it was witchcraft. In fact, that it was witchcraft being carried out by a black servant who worked for one of the families. As it turned out, it wasn't necessarily witchcraft this woman was involved in, but she had been brought up from the Caribbean and was probably, as far as we know, a voodoo practitioner. Which was still something in Puritan times in Salem, Massachusetts, was looked upon pretty strangely.
Some of the children in Salem had been introduced to some of these practices by Tituba, and then when they later got carried away with it, they were quick to point the finger, and from there you could, of course, in witch trials, you could absolve yourself by repenting and accusing others, and so it would just have a snowball effect.
Well, when these girls were brought into trial, they began claiming that they were being bewitched by pretty much everybody they didn't like. in the neighborhood, in the village. In the end, 25 people ended up being hanged or died under questioning involving these witchcraft trials. If I had to guess what it was, I would say it was simply hysteria. I mean, these were people who adamantly believed in the power of the devil and the power of witchcraft at the time. And this was a strict religious community, and people just got carried away.
Did the people of Salem, these Puritan people of Salem, believe that the people accused of witchcraft were really witches? They probably did convince themselves that they were, but there really is, there's other motives involved, and you can, when it's to your benefit, you can convince yourself of all sorts of things.
If it wasn't irrational fear of witches and Satan that drove this town to commit such terrifying acts, what did lie at the root of this evil? What has made 17th century Salem synonymous with insanity and hysteria? Was it something even more sinister, perhaps? Human greed?
The thing about the Salem witch trials is that a lot of it is about greed. It's about people in the community who really covet the property of other people in the community being Salem, Massachusetts, and basically use these witchcraft accusations that these young girls have dreamed up to try to make a land grab, to grab the property of these other people. So, I mean, in some ways, the idea of the witch trials, it fits into a much bigger global picture. There were witch trials in other places. There were witch trials in Europe. There were witch trials in Bermuda. I had an ancestor who was a judge at the witch trials in Bermuda. But in Salem, it's so obvious that there's a real class issue going on, and there's a real sense of some of the families of these girls using this to try to get land and enrich themselves out of the situation, and it really stinks.
In the 1970s, social historians probed the social and economic background of the witch hunts. Salem was more like two towns. There was Salem Town, a prosperous commercial village near the coast, and there was Salem Village, an agricultural hamlet that was much poorer and much more devout and somewhat away from the coast. It turned out most of the accusers came from Salem Village, as did most of their supporters, and most of the defenders came from Salem Town, as did most of their supporters. The proximity of these two towns led to the buildup of the village's resentment of their rich and godless neighbors. Also behind the witch trials was a family feud that made the Capulets and the Montagues seem like the closest of friends. The trouble started back in 1686 when Thomas Putnam Sr. bequeathed the better part of his estate to his second wife and his son by that wife, Joseph Putnam. Like the biblical Joseph, Joseph's elder brothers deeply resented him, especially as he got richer, and even more so when he married into the very wealthy Porter family. Well, it turned out that throughout the trials, the Putnam name was prominent among the accusers. 12-year-old Ann Putnam was the most afflicted of the girls, and the Porter name, or their friends and family, were prominent among the accused.
Then again, maybe it was the Puritans themselves. Their own straight-laced life, a repressive life that kept emotions at the boiling point, a boiling point ready to explode.
In the 20th century, Freudian interpretations came to the fore. These were classic cases of hysteria, the result of repressed pre-adolescent and adolescent sexuality. It made sense that these girls would be repressed. These were Puritans, and Puritans, after all, could be puritanical.
Take a little witchcraft, mix in some Satanism, voodoo, and a little greed, add sexual repression. What do you get?
of the many mysteries surrounding Watergate, most come down to what did Nixon know and when did he know it? And of the many theories, most depend on what he said on the White House tapes. Nixon considered the tapes his personal property. When a judge ordered him to turn them over, the tapes started mysteriously disappearing. And then one of them showed up with an 18.5-minute gap, this gap right in the middle of Nixon's first crucial discussion of Watergate with his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman.
Those missing 18.5 minutes. The most mysterious 18.5 minutes in all of U.S. history. This is what those 18.5 minutes sound like today. So, who was Richard Milhous Nixon, the 37th President of the United States? The man whose crucial words were removed from this tape. Nixon was by all accounts America's most conflicted and enigmatic president. He himself was a mystery. He came from humble beginnings, small-town Yorba Linda, California. The son of Quakers. Always brilliant, always the smartest one in his class. President of the Duke Bar Association. He swore like a dock worker, while at the same time was mortified by any sexual references to women. At the age of 27, he married a high school teacher named Thelma Pat Ryan, the only woman that ever interested him. During World War II, he put his legal skills to work for the Navy. Drawn into Republican politics, he quickly earned a reputation for ruthlessness, playing upon the Red Scare and garnering the epithet Tricky Dick during his 1950 senatorial campaign. The epithet stuck with him for the rest of his life. Publicly, Nixon was a heroic fighter of communism. But there was another side, a darker side. A side that would dog him into his presidency. Nixon's earliest campaign manager and political advisor was Murray Chotiner, a lawyer who specialized in defending members of the mafia. In this cigar-chomping wheeler dealer, Nixon found what future Nixon aide Len Garment called his Machiavelli, a hard-headed exponent of the campaign philosophy that politics is war. When Nixon went on to the White House, both as vice president and later as president, he took Chotiner with him as a key behind-the-scenes advisor. As a result, by the time he became president in 1969, Nixon had a long history with such shady figures as mafia-connected labor leader Jimmy Hoffa, New Orleans mafioso Carlos Marcello, and particularly Los Angeles mob boss Mickey Cohen. Richard Nixon had been on the giving and receiving end of major underworld favors for more than 2 decades. Here's how it all started. Early on, Nixon received a $5,000 contribution from Mickey Cohen, plus free office space for a Nixon for Congress headquarters in one of Cohen's buildings. And there was more to come. Cohen has said his support of Nixon was ordered by the proper persons from back east, meaning Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, the brains behind the mob. Lansky needed to protect his gambling interests in Cuba, especially when it came to the dictator Batista. Many say Lansky chose Nixon. In the mid-50s, Batista designated Lansky the unofficial czar of gambling in Havana. A shrewd master manipulator whose specialty was gambling, Lansky was known to put the hit on anyone who got in the way of the syndicate's business operation, including his childhood friend, Bugsy Siegel. In February 1955, Vice President Richard Nixon proved his worth to the mob when he traveled to Havana to embrace Batista at the despot's lavish private palace. Nixon did his job. He praised the competence and stability of Batista's regime, awarded him a Medal of Honor, and compared him with Abraham Lincoln. And Nixon reported that Batista had vowed to deal with the commies. What Nixon omitted in his report was the Batista-Lansky connection, the rampant government corruption under Batista, and the extreme poverty of most Cubans. Was Nixon in the grip of the mob? Well, Nixon's best friend was Bebe Rebozo, one of Lansky's gambling men in Cuba. An American-born Cuban, Rebozo was a short, swarthy, wealthy Florida banker and land speculator, a most unlikely candidate for presidential advisor and friend. Former mafia consigliere Bill Bonanno, the son of legendary New York godfather Joe Bonanno, asserted that Nixon would never have gotten anywhere without his old mob allegiances. And he reports that through Rebozo, Nixon did business for years with Miami godfather Santo Trafficante. Could that really be?
One of the things about Nixon and the mob, you might say, well, what would attract Nixon to the mob, really? Maybe a couple of things. First of all, mob has money, and politicians are always looking for money. Secondly, Nixon and the mob have something in common in the people they like and the people they dislike. They're both connected with the Cubans. The mob is connected with the anti-Castro Cubans because they had all the big clubs in Havana before Castro took over. Nixon is connected with the Cubans because they're supporters of his, because Bebe Rebozo is his friend. And who do the mob and Richard Nixon both hate? They both hate the Kennedys.
The Kennedys defeated Nixon's 1960 presidential bid. After Nixon lost his bid to become governor of the state of California, he famously said,
"You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore."
His political career seemed to be over. But like a phoenix, he rose from the ashes, appealing to what he called the silent majority. In 1968, he eked out a presidential victory after the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. An assassination by a person many claim was a mob hitman. So, Nixon becomes president, the arch-conservative, commie-hating president. He does the unexpected. He creates Medicaid for the poor. He opens the door to relationships with China by being the first American president to travel to this tightly closed communist nation. He imposes wage and price control. He pushes for public health insurance for all Americans. He accelerates the Vietnam War and then ends it. Incredible achievements. But at the same time, he's developing an out-of-control streak of paranoia. He hates the press. He creates a blacklist of enemies. He tries to use the power of the FBI to intimidate them. He is fanatically driven to quell anti-war protesters.
What Charles Colson's going to do on it, and I suggested he do, and I think they can get away with this, do it with the Teamsters. Just ask them to dig up their 8 thugs.
Yeah.
Just call call, what's his name?
Fitzsimmons.
Is trying to play our game anyway. It's just tell Fitzsimmons.
They've got guys who go in and knock their heads off.
Sure. Murderers.
Then comes Nixon's re-election campaign for a second term, and a little break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The perpetrators get caught and begin to squeal. A cover-up begins at the White House, a cover-up that today is still a mystery.
In 1996, 2 years after Nixon's death, hundreds more hours of tapes were released. They still did not show any evidence that Nixon knew in advance of the Watergate break-in, but there was plenty more evidence that he was involved in the cover-up. And neither Nixon himself nor any of his apologists have ever been able to explain away the evidence of spying, of dirty tricks, of obstruction of justice, of harassment of enemies, of which Watergate was just a part.
The subsequent investigation of the Watergate break-in by the FBI connects the perpetrators to the 1972 Committee to Re-elect the President. CREEP, as it became known, was a fundraising organization of President Richard Nixon's administration. Besides its re-election activities, CREEP was used for money laundering and held a huge slush fund. Funds that were directly and actively involved in the Watergate scandal. CREEP used $500,000 in funds to pay legal expenses for the 5 Watergate burglars after their indictment in September 1972, in exchange for their silence and perjury. But as evidence of a cover-up mounted against the president's staff by the investigation conducted by the Senate Watergate Committee, it was revealed that President Nixon had a tape recording system in his office. He had been recording many conversations in the White House. Recordings that after a series of court battles, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled the president had to hand over to Congress. He ultimately complied. On August 3, 1974, a previously unknown audio tape from June 23, 1972 was released. It had been recorded only a few days after the break-in.
Nixon did eventually release tapes, and on them he could be heard discussing payoffs and offering advice on how to commit perjury. The tape that came to be known as the smoking gun, and it was one in which Nixon can clearly be heard giving explicit directions that the CIA should tell the FBI to lay off the Watergate investigation.
6 days later, Nixon resigned in infamy. End of story. But not quite. Before Nixon was forced to release the tapes by the U.S. Supreme Court, he agreed to release transcripts. Nixon argued that he had to protect national security, so he proposed sensitive information be redacted from the transcripts. Nixon's personal secretary, Rosemary Wood, began transcribing tapes. Soon it was revealed that an 18.5-minute gap existed on tape 342. The tape, which recorded a conversation between President Nixon and Chief of Staff H.R. Bob Haldeman on June 20th, 1972, just 3 days after the break-in. Listen one more time to that 18.5-minute gap.
Have you ever seen the picture of Rosemary Woods erasing? the Watergate tape. There's a very famous picture when this 18.5-minute gap appeared in one of the Watergate tapes that Rosemary Wood said, "Oh, I must have done it by accident when I was transcribing it." She was Nixon's secretary. She said, "I must have done this by accident when I was transcribing it." And there's a picture taken where she shows how she could have her foot on the pedal, her arm over here, the phone. You'd have to be a gymnast to be able to actually do that for 18.5 minutes, which is what she's saying that she did. And it's not that there's nothing on the tape. There's some hum and background noise. It so clearly was erased by Richard Nixon or one of his top henchmen.
A court-appointed panel of experts concluded that the gap was caused by hand operations, not foot operations as of the pedal, as Woods maintained. Moreover, the experts determined that there were at least 5 and possibly up to 9 separate erasures. At this point, even the conservative National Review threw in the towel, saying believers in an accidental theory could gather for lunch in a phone booth.
It's hard to imagine what could be any more incriminating than the stuff that actually came out on the tapes when they were revealed. I mean, you had Nixon talking about bribes, about getting the Hells Angels or the Mafia to beat up or kill anti-war protesters, about making people disappear and so forth. So it's almost mind-boggling what he could find so incriminating that he'd have to make just 18 minutes disappear. But if it wasn't the world's most convenient accident, I think it was a deliberate cover-up of something. Could have been even some discussion of one of the assassinations from the 60s. I know there was a lot of talk about Cuba on the tapes and hush money from Howard Hughes and so forth.
When you think of all the bad stuff, all the incriminating evidence that was on the tapes that they didn't erase, that they didn't throw into a bonfire, you gotta wonder, how bad must this stuff have been? You know, is it the secret connection between Nixon and the mob? Is it the secret connection between Nixon and the Kennedy assassination? I mean, it must have been pretty bad. The stuff that he didn't erase was bad enough that it would have gotten him impeached. This stuff had to be far worse, and we are only left wondering what it could be.
If I had to theorize about what would be so extreme that Nixon would never let it come out, I would say it might be some personal knowledge he might have had of JFK's assassination, since Nixon was in fact in Dallas on the day of the assassination, supposedly left about the time Kennedy flew into town, or it would have had something to do with government involvement in the Bay of Pigs or the subsequent mafia plots to kill Castro that weren't revealed until 2 or 3 years after Nixon left office.
My guess would be that it contains evidence of another crime unconnected with Watergate of a very serious nature that Nixon is involved with. I don't know of anything else that makes sense.
Listen one more time. Perhaps one day, new technologies will reveal the mystery of all presidential mysteries. The song Abraham, Martin, and John, written in 1968, is a tribute to the 4 great American icons of social change: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, and Robert F. Kennedy. It was written as a response to the assassinations of King and the younger Robert Kennedy in April and June of 1968. The verse goes, "Has anybody here seen my old friend Martin? Can you tell me where he's gone? He freed a lot of people, but it seems the good, they die young. But I just looked around and he's gone." Not everybody loved and admired America's greatest civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr.
You know, King is a friend of the Kennedys. So when we say government involvement, I'm not saying ordered by the president or the attorney general, but King had a real powerful enemy in the U.S. government at that time in J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover's the director of the FBI. He is convinced that King is a communist, that King wants to destroy America, that King is a liar. He's sort of a prude, kind of, Hoover is, and he's really angry about King's affairs that have come. And how does he know about King's affairs? Because J. Edgar Hoover wiretaps the living daylights out of Martin Luther King. The Kennedys say, yeah, you can do some wiretapping on King to see if he's, if he's subversive, as you say, but they give him very limited authority. Hoover goes out there and wiretaps practically every place King is going. He's got undercover FBI agents watching him, and there's very credible proof that letters that went to King telling him that he was information about him was going to be revealed if he didn't do the right thing came from the FBI. There's very credible proof that the FBI sent letters to King trying to blackmail him to get him to resign, or King thought to commit suicide, and saying, we're going to reveal all these secrets about you that we found if you don't kind of get out of the way. So when you have an enemy that powerful in the government, and when your cause is so opposed to some very established interests in the country, there's a lot of people who have reason to want to sort of end your cause. And so it's very easy for me to believe that there's a conspiracy there.
On April 3rd, 1968, King delivered his stirring "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech in Memphis, Tennessee.
But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
One day later, at 6:01 p.m., April 4th, 1968, as King stood on a second-floor motel balcony, enjoying a quiet Memphis evening, a shot rang out. The bullet entered through King's right cheek and smashed his jaw. After emergency surgery, King was pronounced dead at St. Joseph's Hospital at 7:05 p.m. The facts surrounding the shooting have been disputed, especially the claim that James Earl Ray was the lone assassin.
There can be no doubt of the FBI's animosity toward King. There's no doubt that they focused more attention on surveillance of King than protection of King. They knew there were threats to his life, and they never told him. They removed a black security guard from the detail protecting King. And hours after his death, and despite a description of the suspect's car, they had not yet issued an APB. The FBI, the police, there's no question that they were at the very least incompetent and motivated at least partly by racism. It did not seem such a large step from blackmailing King to conspiring to murder him, but there is absolutely no hard evidence that they took that step.
The King assassination is actually the subject of the first nonfiction book I ever wrote for an adult market, and I personally interviewed James Earl Ray in prison twice in the 1980s. I don't believe he pulled the trigger. I believe he was involved in criminal operations, as he said he was. He wasn't the sharpest knife in the set. Here's a guy who once almost fell out of his own getaway car fleeing the scene of a supermarket holdup, and he was driving. So this is not a guy that would suddenly break out of prison, devote himself to stalking someone he'd never seen, come up with tens of thousands of dollars that the FBI later claimed he secured from robberies that they couldn't even prove occurred. He was a known armed robber, so they assumed that he was making his way across the country robbing banks, but they couldn't specify any bank robberies. There were so many different conflicting reports of where the shot was fired from. The bathroom that the bullet supposedly came from to strike King was at a very awkward angle. If Ray had stood in the bathtub as described, he probably could not have hit the motel, much less hit King in the face. He had no experience as a rifleman whatsoever. The fact that he was able to concoct 3 or 4 false identities, supposedly names picked out of the air, and when they came back to real people, all of the men in question at least generally resembled him. To me, it defies coincidence. We know that he had visitors at one of his rooming houses in Toronto. 2 different men came to see him on separate occasions, seen by the landlady, never identified. When his car was found abandoned in Birmingham, Alabama, the ashtray full of cigarette butts, Ray had never smoked in his life. The passenger side of the car had muddy footprints all over the carpet. It just really defies, logic to me.
Martin Luther King pissed a lot of people off. A lot of people didn't like Martin Luther King. The FBI didn't like Martin Luther King. A lot of white bigots didn't like Martin Luther King. A lot of conservative politicians didn't like Martin Luther King because of his advocacy on behalf of the poor and against the Vietnam War. There's a whole lot of people who have issues with Martin Luther King. And I have always found it just about impossible to believe that James Earl Ray was the sole shooter, perhaps that James Earl Ray was even involved. I've always felt that he must be a fall guy.
Well, he named an individual that he called Raoul, who identified himself to Ray as some sort of arms smuggler. The phone number that Raoul gave to Ray was later traced by attorney Mark Lane to a Louisiana State Police barracks outside Baton Rouge. I personally believe that it was a group of racists involved in a group that no longer exists called the National States' Rights Party, a neo-Nazi group affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan, who also supplied one of Ray's later attorneys, Jesse Stoner. I believe it was an organized group of racists that took King out. They'd been trying to kill him since 1955. And Ray is sort of not quite simple-minded, but certainly a simple guy who had lived all his life in the criminal milieu, made a perfect patsy. And he wasn't one that they even had to kill like Oswald, because he'd gone through the steps of apparently stalking King across country. And they had different items with his fingerprints on them that were dropped in Memphis. So he was going away regardless.
I know a historian who has done some research, and he believes that the government is involved in this killing. But he is convinced, and he's told me this, that if he tries to write this book, that he would be killed. This isn't some flaky guy. This is a real historian who's published very reputable history books.
The one thing there is no doubt about is that the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed American history.
Able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
It's where they've got the alien spaceships in the warehouse. It's where they're dissecting the alien bodies. It's where they're perfecting teleportation and time travel. And, there is, the government has a secret base there. They don't tell anybody much about it. And they're not ready to confirm or deny a lot of stuff. So the result is that people can kind of, it's like a sausage, they can stick any conspiracy theory they want into and believe it.
On the official U.S. geological map of America's geographical features, one place is a blank spot. It is the most mysterious place on the planet, unofficially called Area 51.
Area 51, according to the CIA, is the most sensitive area on Earth. Those are the words from the CIA. It is a place at Nellis Air Force Base, bombing gunning range north of Las Vegas, Nevada, where it does hold many secrets.
Recognizing the tourist potential, the state of Nevada renamed the highway that runs along its eastern boundary the Extraterrestrial Highway. Who actually is in charge of Area 51 is a bit of a mystery, since the United States government barely recognizes its existence. Geographically, it is located in the heart of America's nuclear testing grounds and the Nellis Air Force bombing range.
Area 51, I actually worked for 8 years within a couple of miles of it. I was teaching in a little town called Pahrump, Nevada, which is 60 miles outside Las Vegas, and most of the students in my class had parents working on the nuclear test site where Area 51 is located. It's a place that's acknowledged by the government, although they won't say what goes on there. It's separate, supposedly, from the actual nuclear test, but there are always the persistent rumors that alien craft have been taken there, have been experimented with, that some of their technology may be involved in the stealth aircraft that we have today. Also, at one point in the 70s, there were Bigfoot sightings around Area 51, which is very unusual to find a creature of that kind reported in the desert instead of the mountains and the forests. So it's an area that remains controversial, at least. The Las Vegas chapter of Greenpeace used to sneak people out there to protest the nuclear blasts that went on underground, and they would get arrested occasionally.
Strange thing is, if anybody ever goes to the Area 51, which I did just last year, you don't get very close to it. You're many miles away from the Groom Lake and from the facilities itself. And it's controlled by sensors. They have Black Hawk helicopters flying the area. Wackenhut Hut is the security company for them. Private contractor also. They run around in SUVs and Humvees checking anybody. The Delta Force has attempted many times to breach the security of Area 51, are sometimes somewhat successful, but according to the information we receive, they are not very successful. The people are flown out from Las Vegas to Area 51 in the morning, and planes leave at night. They come out in buses, windows blacked out. It's very compartmentalized so that people don't have to share any information or can't share any information with each other about what department they're in and what they're doing.
Area 51 seems to have its origins during the height of the Cold War conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Area 51 started in the 50s with Johnson and the Skunk Works. They were looking for a place that they could develop the U-2. They wanted a very remote area with a long landing field, and that's where they came up with the Area 51. That's one of the engineers knew about the area because he had flown over it. It was a perfect site, so that's where it started. And the government has now expanded that some 4,000 acres more. President Clinton exempted them, Area 51, from environmental controls. They can do whatever they want there. They're exempt.
Maybe Area 51 is merely where the government is developing its next generation of military weapons, especially new aircraft.
Well, the parents of the students that I had there in Pahrump were all under government confidentiality agreements, and so if they told anything to their kids, it never got as far as the classroom, but there were always reports of people from the community or hitchhikers traveling through that would claim they'd seen things in the sky, whatever it would be. Not only lights, but sometimes dark shapes, triangular forms flying overhead, which today sound a lot like the stealth bomber.
It makes perfect sense to have a super secret facility for developing our stealth technology. But in the 70s, rumors began to circulate. There was an even more secret area within Area 51 itself, called S4.
George Knapp interviewed Bob Lazar, who professed to have worked at Area 51 in the S4 section, and his job was to back engineer a flying saucer. For lack of a better word, I'll use flying saucer.
There was absolutely no ET craft, ET technology, anything like that at Area 51. This is why S4 was made specifically to separate it there. People at Area 51 do not have the clearance. The S4 facility is an area just off the Papoose lake bed, dry lake bed. And it consists of 9 hangars. The hangars have sloped doors on them with a sand texture coating. Everywhere I went to, I was essentially escorted. I was paid by the Department of Naval Intelligence, and what they're doing, researching extraterrestrial craft, is beyond me, but that's where my checks came from, so I can only assume that they were in charge of that. The crafts originated from a planet that orbited the Zeta Reticuli star system. Zeta Reticuli 1 and Zeta Reticuli 2 are two stars of a binary star system. The first disk I saw, I believe it was the second, or I think it was the third time I was up there. This particular occasion, it pulled up to one of the hangar doors, which were normally closed, and the last one was open. We came out, and I saw the disk in the hangar. Upon seeing it, it struck me that, well, this explains all the UFO sightings. Not thinking that it was an extraterrestrial craft, that this must have been some advanced form of fighter that we've been working on for years, and people have just caught it being tested, so on and so forth. And it never even occurred to me, even though I was looking at an extraterrestrial vehicle, that this wasn't man-made. It probably really hit me when I got inside the craft and looked around and began to understand how the craft was operated, and finally grasped the whole project as a whole, as what we were doing, the fact that we weren't building this thing, we were trying to find out how it was made. We were back engineering it.
So, stories persist that S4 within Area 51 is home to the alien craft that crashed outside Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. The place where the United States government is attempting to reverse engineer new weapons and anti-gravity spacecraft. If this is true, then we are not alone in the universe, and Area 51 is concealing the most profound secret known to mankind.